Our next speaker is going to be the person who, thanks Jason, who's really been the progenitor of all the work that led to the forum today, Dr. Lynne Reader. She's been the dynamo that's pushed all this work along in Australia 21, and she's going to talk about empathy conversations and her experience that led to her report. So over to you, Lynne.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mike. So, as Mike noted in the introduction, Australia 21 sponsored a pilot study on empathy as a tool of engagement and understanding. And I worked on that study with an advisory group, including Liz Temple and Lisa Petheram and Kylie Marks and Lynne Stevens. So Lynne and Liz are here today. And part of the, even answering that question from David, one of the things that we're hoping to get out of this project is the thought that we really need to be taking into account the understanding that neuroscience is bringing of how our mind and body work together when we're making decisions. So that's what this program was about. So before I go into the details of the study, I want to go into the background. Why were we interested in this project? And I know that some of you have already got copies of the study, and it's on our website if you need it as well. So one of the main reasons that we went into that Australia 21 thinks that mindfulness, compassion and empathy should be considered by those in government and industry is, as I said, neuroscience is providing us with more information than we have ever had previously on how the brain works. So this is a quote from one of the participants, really upfront saying why they think empathy is an important tool for government to consider. So the new MRI and PET scan technologies are providing us with insights into the mind-body-brain connection. And we know that when we're anxious or stressed, our body gets triggered and we set up a fight, flight, freeze response. And when we're in that anxious moment, our physiology is such that the part of the brain that is responsible for deep thinking, reflection and creativity simply shuts down. So in a real emergency, we don't need the luxury of thinking because our system automatically and immediately switches on a reaction. If we're driving along and all of a sudden a car starts coming for us, we're not thinking, we're literally in response mode. And unfortunately, that happens, whether a car's coming towards us or whether we in our own mind have turned something into a worry, and that can be what someone said to us or something that happened to us, the challenge is that we have a modern brain capable of thinking and creating, but it is also capable of overthinking and ruminating. And it sits over the top of our emotion regulation systems, which have a strong focus on survival. And that means that we can turn non-emergency situations into emergency situations on a daily basis. So as I said, when that happens, we trigger our survival system. When we perceive something as a threat, we will trigger our survival system, and that will shut off our deep thinking and creativity pretty much at exactly the time we need it. So one of the main assumptions of this study that we did is that CEOs, politicians, senior managers need to take into account this new science and understanding of their own physiology when they're making judgments about and taking decisions about what they're doing and how that affects others. So key to the relevance of this study is the notion that the competency of empathy, I think it's important that we are talking about these as competencies and as motivations, not as values. Because you can have a value of empathy and compassion, but if you don't have the competency, you're not able to enact it. So we're talking about the competency of empathy and training that, the competency of empathy, the motivation of compassion, underpinned by mindfulness, and that's where the training comes in. And those three all have a role to play in business, community and political environments, and indeed our family environments. So we want that because by developing the human capacity to perceive the mind of ourselves and others, we turn off the autopilot of ingrained behaviours and habitual responses, and therefore create better choices. So as Nicholas said, this is not about being nice, this is not about pandering to people. This is a real challenge for us at the moment. It's an evolutionary challenge for us. So, and as Nicholas said, these sorts of requirements are already in government legislation. This is a list of the 10 principles, the current, if you go onto the website, for Australian policymakers. Regulators must implement regulation with common sense, empathy and respect. But if the training's not there, then how is that going to happen? So I love this quote from the Italian neuroscientist, so one of the leading in the world, Antonio Damasio. The time will come when the issue of human responsibility in general moral terms, as well as on matters of justice and application, will take into account the evolving science of consciousness. Perhaps that time is now. So that's again one of the underpinning assumptions and guiding principles for our study. So as far as we know, we are the only species for millions of light years in any one direction that have the capability of self-reflection and self-awareness. And whilst there's a lot of debate about the definition and nature of consciousness, in that quote, I think Damasio is challenging CEOs, politicians, managers to no longer ignore how the mind and body work together when making judgments that affect others. So in examining the inclusion of empathy conversation as a potential policy-making tool, we recognise that there are already many resources available to policymakers. They've already got surveys, they've already got economic modelling and focus groups and meta-analysis. All those things are still are available to them, but none require them to have to be directly open to the lived experience, of those who will be impacted by those decisions. So the pilot study that we did was designed to evaluate a particular process of empathic understanding and how that might assist in the development of more compassionate policy resources. So here, sorry, I've already gone to this, the definitions. So the definitions that we used, one from Roman Krasnarek and one from Paul Gilbert. So the background, I suppose, for me being involved in this study was I attended 2014. I went to Stanford Uni, and here in the middle of Silicon Valley, there's a Centre for Compassion and Altruism Research that James Doty runs, and there Dan Martin spoke, and Roman spoke, and Paul Gilbert spoke, and there were Daniel Siegel, Rick Hansen. I mean, it was just the most wonderful. And Petrina Barson, who's here today, she was there as well. So a lot of the ideas came out of that conference, which was just, as I say, quite life-changing. So we used the definition of empathy by Roman and that of compassion by Paul Gilbert. We wanted to ensure that we actually moved beyond empathy as a connection, as stepping into someone else's shoes, to compassion, which is moving towards suffering with wanting to take action to prevent or alleviate it. So there are two things. One is the connection, and then second is the action to respond to it. So the use of empathy conversations to create social change has been championed by Roman Krasnarek. He was here in Melbourne last month or so. There 2,000 people turned up to the Melbourne Town Hall to an empathy, I know Nick, you were there, to hear about that empathy, that Roman's program that Roman's doing. So he talks about empathy as an essential transforming quality that we must develop in the 21st century, and contends that we should, and he says, move beyond empathy in individual exchanges to collective empathy and the role that plays in tackling the issues that we're facing, climate change, inequality, all those issues that are confronting us today. So, and Paul Gilbert similarly says that the recognition of our interdependence and the increase in scientific data demonstrating the significant benefits of empathy and integrated behaviour are important components of progressing societal well-being. And that's why in this forum today, we linked with Dan, who is over in San Francisco, and later on this afternoon we'll be linking over to London with Chris Rawan. This is a global thinking around how we're going to really get on better. I mean, really, that's what it is. How do we get on better than we are at the moment on a global basis? So the project aims, this empathy conversation project that we did, we're there to develop and assess a process pretty much for facilitating empathy conversations between people from unliked lived experience. So how do we actually, if you haven't, had it, we all only have one experience of our life. We have one experience of where we're born and how our family operated. And so connecting with others is really trying to say, well, how do we actually create that? And then we wanted to work out whether the methodology that we used was present in this study was acceptable. Did it work? Did everyone connect with it? And then we wanted to gain some indication as to whether that would actually make differences to the, I'll go in a minute to who was involved in the process, but we had a group of people in policy making and decision making practices and people who were in financial and unemployment difficulty. So they were the two groups in the study. We wanted to see if we get at least some indication of whether that would make changes to those in the policy area. So the study comprised 14 participants. There were two groups. So we worked with Centre Care. I'm based in Ballarat. We worked in Centre Care Ballarat to identify people who would be in a position to be able to take part in this, who chose to take part in the conversation. And then through our Australia 21 networks, we identified ministerial advisors and CEOs and senior public servants, so people who were in a position to make policy changes. And there were significant differences in those two groups. So, one was, the educational differences were significant. Certainly the financial circumstances of both groups were different, and their ability, to influence in society was quite different. So, as Dan was saying, we used training quite similar to what he was talking about. So we spent time using the work of Paul Gilbert, using his 3 emotion regulation systems. So we talked about the threat and survival system and the drive and achievement and affiliation and soothing. We also talked about, the barriers to empathy. Barriers to receiving, to giving and to self. So there were quite a number of aspects that were similar, and we also gave them practices. So I did one-on-one training with each of the participants, and so I gave them mindfulness exercises to do, but also thinking about, it's a good thing to do anyway. There's just every day, how much of your day are you spending in your survival system? And how much of the day are you feeling threatened? How much of the day are you in your, what we call positive drive? So getting up, getting out, getting off to work, that's all good. How much are you spending in your negative drive, overachieving, working too hard, all those. And then how much are you spending in your soothing system? How much are you actually relaxed and calm? And relating to others, that's the important thing, because it's not just about being calm, It's like knowing the physiology, that when you are calm, you are making better decisions and you are connecting to people. You're actually aware of people around you and connecting to them. So we did a lot of that. As I said, we used Paul Gilbert's training from the Compassionate Mind Foundation. I went to Manchester last year, and Paul has a Compassionate Mind Foundation conference every year. So there was a lot of useful material that I used for putting that training together. And the pilot study questions, so it was important that the people in the conversation were supported. So not only did they get the training, they were also given specific questions to address. And those questions were derived from the literature, and then we discussed with our group, and tailored them for this project. So they were designed so that we had the initial and final set of questions were shared questions. So they were questions like, have you had an experience where someone has shared a story with you and that story helped you, connect at a difficult time in your life? So they're quite, I say, vulnerable. It required you to be very open, and it was terrific. Every one of the conversations, it was a very open and exchange. And people actually commented how surprised they were at how open and connected they got very quickly. So, and then also we had a number of questions in the middle that were just by the group 2 people, so that were the people in positions of influence, to ask the Centre Care members about things like, how could the agencies and experiences, the organisations that you deal with better understand and be aware of your needs. So, so when we say, what is an empathy conversation? How is it different from you and I meeting at morning tea and having a chat? How is it different from an interview? How is it different from a focus group? So we used Roman Krasnarek's measures of empathy conversations. So he identifies 6 qualities. So one is curiosity about a stranger, radical listening, taking off masks, concern for others, a creative experience, a spirit, and sheer courage. And so I'm just going to, these are quotes from the participants. So you can see that each of these qualities were demonstrated in the conversations. But for any larger study, we would say we would need to more, I think, clearly delineate the ways of measuring these qualities. But certainly in this program, each of them were present. So then just to go to testing the effectiveness, we really, this just tells you quickly, we had evaluation surveys, we did focus group discussions with the Centre Care clients, and then we did conversation and from the transcripts themselves. So each of the conversations were recorded. And so I don't have time to go into the analysis, but what we did was so these were the sort of themes that emerged out of the coding of the data. So we, as I say, recorded the conversations, and then the qualitative data from the focus groups and the evaluation surveys was identified and subjected to thematic analysis, and then we essentially identified common themes and then sorted using an affinity diagram approach. So, and then these were the themes that emerged in the and in the report. There's a lot of discussion around each of these areas. But as I say, I just don't have time to go into it today. But the good thing was that that one of the big things we wanted to test was did the process work? You know, did the training and the background reading and giving people the questions, did that sort of support an empathy conversation? And these sort of quotes, you know, give you some indication that people all felt that that the process itself worked. And 100%, you know, from a small group, but everyone in the group said that they would do it again or recommend it to other people. Now, the big issue is that we, because people were chosen through Centre Care and because we chose people through our network, these are people who were already, you know, had buy-in, if you like. So our big challenge in any larger study, and that's what we're wanting to do soon, is do a larger study to test it, you know, across a wider range of participants. If you're not choosing, if you're working in a government department and a government department says, you know, we're wanting our policy people, our senior policy people, because that's, you know, we don't want this just for frontline. It's really about senior policy people having direct access to lived experiences on the areas, on the issues that they're dealing with, that they're having on whose behalf they're making decisions. So if you're told to do that, that's going to be a very different process. And but we're working with Dan Martin, and Dan Martin has already said that he would be pleased to work with us on a larger project. So we'd be using his training material in that project. But overall, the findings demonstrate that the background training and empathy conversation processes provided to the participants enabled them to connect with the person from the other group at a depth that both surprised them and allowed them to take on the other person's perspective. And I have to say that worked both ways. It wasn't just, you know, the people in policy who were saying, oh yes, I get, you know, what it's like to, you know, to turn up at Centrelink or wherever and be judged, you know. It worked the other way as well, because the people who are financially and you know, in unemployment, they were saying, wow, you know, I thought I was the only one who had problems. But because they had, but I mean, what I'm saying is because they worked at a very human level, so they were saying in very short time into the conversation, they got, oh, my mother died. Oh, wow, my mother died just a few weeks ago as well. Or my husband was unemployed. Yeah, well, my husband's unemployed as well. So it didn't, you know, obviously the person that was in, you know, whose husband was unemployed and who ran one of Canberra's biggest, you know, associations, that's not going to impact her as much as the other person. But they still got that, you know, crap happens for everyone. So it was quite and it was a real shared experience, and I think that was one of the things that came out of this. So our initial, see, you know, they were saying people felt comfortable to share. I remember the night before the first conversation, and I was thinking, you know, like really, they could just go, "How are you? Oh, okay. You know, what did you do today? Or not much." You know, like it could have been really a very bland, flat, non-connected experience, and that didn't. And it just in every experience, it was terrific. So they really got down to a very deep, connection, and it surprised them. So, and so the indications are that these outcomes say that given the right circumstances, it takes very little time for strangers to find the human connections that unite us. As I said, in any larger study, we'd need to test this common humanity finding, but for this study, it was very clear. And so as I say, we talked about these sort of questions as to how, one of the questions was, what brings a sense of contentment to your life? So this example here, Chris was a senior public servant living in Canberra, and Rigo was a refugee who had tried to commit suicide in the refugee camp. And so, but for each of them, even though they were having such different lived experiences, they were able to say, you know, pretty much the same things connect us. So I do feel that that these conversations, we didn't get enough response back, in the 6 weeks after the initial evaluation, and we need to work on that later. So we can't say that it's changed people and that change happens over a long period of time. In any future study, we would be testing that much more in more detail. But it seems to think that, it did support new ways of connecting with others. So again, these are quotes from the study. And this is an example. So when you'd say, give me an example of where this has worked and how it might work. So Stanford Uni in 2008, they did a work in Nepal. So they went to address that there was a high rate of infant mortality, and babies were dying from conditions that in other countries would have been non-fatal. So the Stanford team thought, well, what they need is, a number of incubators. We just need to buy them incubators and send them across. But when they went over and had these, empathy conversations with them, they actually found that, one, there's no electricity, so no use sending over these incubators. They require electricity. There's no one to train them, So what they did was come up with this, and develop a new kind of incubator. So this is an example of these little, sort of a modern. It's a bag rather than a incubator, but it actually had very similar results. And so they were able to save huge numbers of lives. And, from $20,000 for the cost of an incubator, these cost about $25. So it's really, connecting with really what are your needs, and often we don't do that in policy. So I'll just quickly say that additional research is required, so we are going to do a larger project. If anyone has got any ideas for what that might look like, or organisations that would be happy to be involved, let me know. So these are some of the things that we need. As I said, we need a more diverse group, and we need the outcomes tested, and they're there. So we'll keep following that up. And so, but we did get a sense that these quotes tell you that people feel like it made a difference. It wasn't just I'm not sure how to work, like we can talk to people. This was being open and vulnerable to the people on whose behalf you're making decisions on, and it showed that that there was a space for that in policy making. So I'm just aware that we're running over time, but and I really want to get on to the next session because we're very fortunate.
Just take one question, perhaps.
Just one question? Yeah.
Which one do you want to choose?
Oh, okay. Just this lady. I don't think there are any. Just call it.
Absolutely everything you're saying.
Yeah.
The question that
David
directed at Nicholas
Yeah.
a few moments ago, if I can rephrase it slightly.
Yeah.
David asked, if you're breaking down the government from scratch, what would you do?
Yeah.
Right, and Nicholas, your response, forgive me, was in relation to a policy response.
Yeah, that's right.
I heard that question in terms of structure.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, yeah.
I don't doubt that public servants, that people in business, that whatever sphere we're working in, can do that. a damaged, destroyed, completely misfitted structure, whether it be a constitution, whether it be a business structure, whatever. What obligation do we have to address that structural issue before we move on?
Yeah, interesting. So it's a real chicken and egg, isn't it? And really we have to know that the structures we create as humans are the structures we create. So I think that we have to change ourselves first, and then we create new structures. So by understanding this, how the mind-body works together, how understanding the neuroscience of it, we are in a better position. We won't know what structures we're going to create until, on a systemic basis, we've taken all this into account and really are coming to our work situation, to government, from this perspective and not from a fight-flight. So politics, is so confrontational. But we know that there are legal systems in the world. Some of them are confrontational and some of them aren't. So we can create structures that don't have to sit within that framework, but there's a lot of change required. And so that's why I'm excited about this forum, that this is a really, great start of that discussion. And the talk that we'll have this afternoon from Chris Ruan is really saying how are they trying to sort of get this thinking into, schools, hospitals, politics. Sorry. Yeah, I think we do. Yeah, I'll take questions at lunchtime, sorry, because otherwise we'll miss out.